The Authors Guild Foundation is the educational and philanthropic branch of the Authors Guild,
America's oldest and largest professional organization for writers.
The Authors Guild Foundation educates, supports, and protects American writers
to ensure that a rich, diverse body of literature can flourish.
We do this by advocating for authors' rights,
educating authors across the country in the business of writing,
and promoting an understanding of the value of writers.
The foundation advocates on issues of copyright,
a right enshrined in Article 1 of the Constitution, guaranteeing authors the right to own and profit from their work.
We fight piracy and the theft of creative work.
We promote literacy and increased access to books in disadvantaged communities.
We advocate for increased funding and outreach for public libraries.
The Foundation believes that an abundance of free literary expression is essential to our democracy.
And that can only be achieved by protecting authors' constitutional and moral rights to benefit from their work.
The Authors Guild Foundation works on behalf of all writers, emerging, mid-career, and established writers in all genres.
Novelists and essayists.
Children and YA books.
Poets and translators.
Journalists and nonfiction authors.
Thriller and mystery writers.
You get the picture.
Through our many educational programs, the Authors Guild Foundation teaches writers the business of writing
and equips them with the knowledge and tools they need to succeed.
We foster and celebrate diverse voices in American literature
and promote the ability of writers to earn a livelihood so they can keep writing.
The foundation works to defend the author's right to free expression
and prevent erosion of the exchange of knowledge and ideas.
We advocate for strong, effective intellectual property laws,
as well as fair treatment of authors, so that writing remains a viable profession.
So if you love books, writing, literary culture, the written word,
moving poetry, excellence in journalism, the perfect thriller,
please make a donation.
All of us at the Authors Guild Foundation thank you so much for your support.
Thank you 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 for your support.
Good morning, everybody. Check, 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 check. Welcome to Day 3, Session 5 of the Authors Guild inaugural Words, Ideas, and Thinkers Festival. My name is Lynn Bolger, and I am the Executive Director of the Foundation. Thank you. Before we launch in, I want to give a big, heartfelt thank you to our sponsors and partners who have enabled us to offer these amazing talks free and open to the public. And I also want to say thanks and ever more thanks to the wonderful people at Shakespeare and Company. They understood from day one what this festival would mean to them in terms of workload, and I did not. It was a ton of work, and all of which they have done professionally and cheerfully and well. They have been a joy to work with. And if you did not buy tickets for tonight's dinner, you might want to go to the show at 7:30 that they have put on at the Bernstein Theater. It's getting raves, and there are cards out on the check-in table about the play. And oh my, haven't we had such a remarkable series of conversations over the past 2 days. I've loved how certain ideas have resonated back and forth with threads and concepts zigzagging between authors. For example, how lovely in Roxana and Geraldine's talk that the MLK Jr. quote about the arc of the moral universe was echoed back at David Blight and Skip Gates' talk last night. And the idea of backlash after progress, the example of the Supreme Court was used, which tees up this morning's 11:30 with Linda Greenhouse and Nico Bowie perfectly. But this morning, we turn our focus to the climate crisis, and I can think of no more important topic for which we really do need to reimagine America, or really the world. But as Elizabeth Kolbert pointed out to David Remnick in a New Yorker Radio Hour podcast, the U.S. is responsible for about a quarter of the carbon in the atmosphere. So it's on us, people. Elizabeth Kolbert is a staff writer for The New Yorker and one of our leading thinkers on climate change. She has thought about and framed the issue in myriad ways and in ways that we lay people can understand. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Sixth Extinction, for example, she argues that our world is at the start of the sixth extinction event and how these recent extinctions are driven by human activity. She will speak with Authors Guild Council Board Chair Doug Preston. Besides being the best board chair an organization could ask for, Doug is a journalist and novelist. He has written 36 or so books, including narrative nonfiction like The Monsters of Florence and The Lost City of the Monkey Gods, and the Pendergrass thriller series that he writes with Lincoln Child. With that, I welcome Doug and Betsy. Please come up. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn, for that embarrassing introduction. So, Betsy, we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you. I think the last time I was here was my kid was actually performing on this very stage.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
He
that's
wasn't
cool.
a very good actor, but we won't go there. Yeah.
So, I'm curious, I'd like to start with learning a little bit about your trajectory as a writer, because you were an English major at Yale. I was an English major. I was told that was a completely useless major, and I was never going anywhere in life, and I imagine you were probably told the same thing. So how did you get from being an English literature major to being one of the great science writers in the world today? What was that trajectory?
Well, I was actually a German literature major to make it actually worse. It's a long and winding road, and the great thing about journalism, as you know, I mean, the only thing I can say is, so I went to Germany to study German literature, and I ended up stringing for the New York Times. I gave up the study of German literature very quickly, and it was actually the time of the Pershing missile protests, so they needed people, and I just was hooked by journalism, and took a long winding road. Went to the Times, covered politics for a long time, Albany politics, and then I went to the New Yorker. I was also covering politics for the New Yorker, and sort of what happened was, and this is, I don't know how exciting this is, but it was just at the moment when the news churn, the web was taking over, and it was very difficult to cover politics for a weekly because things were out of date immediately. And I remember David Remnick saying to me at the start of my career at the New Yorker, you can never write something for the New Yorker that can't hold for a week. And that was really tough, and so I started to think about issues that were going to be holdable for a week, a month, a year, always going to be true. And that really led me to climate change. And at the time, it was still this, debatable issue. So I had this insane idea that I was going to solve this issue once and for all. I was going to, lay it out, and people were going to understand once and for all whether this was a big issue or not. I had not even answered the question for myself. And that really is a long and winding story of how I came to really not cover science so much as environmental issues, I guess.
So what was your first piece for the New Yorker, and how did you break in?
Well, I was actually hired to write a column. People might remember it, the old Andy Logan column around City Hall, and that David had just taken over as editor of The New Yorker, and he wanted to revive that column. So that was actually what I was hired to do. That's what I started out doing.
Well, that's good. And then you turned to climate change, and I guess your first book on climate change was Notes from a Catastrophe. And what I love about that book, and actually about your journalism in general, is first of all, you go to whatever crazy place it is that you need to write about, and you find the most interesting people to talk to, and you put all this together. Tell us how you do that.
Well, it's as you know, and you've written really some of my favorite stories in The New Yorker. I mean, going way back. I think I mentioned to you that my husband teaches one of your stories, the ones on the Clovis points. The guy is faking those. That was such a great story. Anyway, you do a lot of background work before you go out. You try to talk to as many people as you can before you show up places, because I have had the experience. I actually once went all the way to Australia, and something that I thought was going to be happening was not happening, and no one had bothered to tell me that was not happening, and that is a terrifying experience for a reporter. So you have to try to, you don't just show up and say, okay, let's hope this works out. You really have to do a lot of groundwork and talk to people and get a pretty good idea, and then a lot of, then there is a lot of crossing your fingers that when you get there to this exotic place, you will actually be able to get where you want to go. There are times where I've arrived and the weather's bad and the helicopter's not taking off or whatever. It's the more exotic the place you go, which is often great for a reporter. Reporters love exotic places because your readers aren't familiar with them. So just going there is part of the fun of it. The higher the chances of logistical nightmares is.
So what are some of those logistical nightmares? What are some of the most frightening experiences you've had as a journalist covering the climate change issue?
Well, there's frightening from the perspective of this story just isn't going to work, or frightening like your life is in danger frightening.
I like your life is in danger frightening.
Okay, your life is in danger frightening, definitely. Well, it was the time I really felt my life was in danger. I was out on the Great Barrier Reef in the middle of the night with someone who didn't. I recount this story in the sixth Extinction. We were supposed to get water samples about a mile out from this tiny little research station, but you had to walk across the Great Barrier Reef, and this guy that I was with, unbeknownst to me, did not know how to use the GPS machine. And so we were walking on the reef. You're walking on the reef as the tide was coming in, and we didn't know where we were going, and since we didn't know where we were going, we didn't really know exactly how to get back. So that was, I think, the closest, I actually came, and finally, he did figure it out. I'm here, that proves it, and we got back. But that was probably the closest to actually, being washed out to sea. But another time that was not scary, because the people reassured me that it wasn't scary, was I was on the Greenland ice sheet when, in an area near enough to the coast that there are a lot of crevasses, and the crevasses can be covered in snow, and you can fall through them quite easily. And I did not fall through them, as you can tell, because I'm here. But the guy who ran the research station, who was a great guy and a fearless guy, just last summer did fall through the ice. So someone who really knew the ice was, I thought, very careful. But I think it's a testament to, and died, and obviously that's a death sentence, to how fast things were changing on Greenland, that even someone who knew what they were doing ended up killed. So I should have been scared at that point, but I wasn't.
So how about in terms of journalism, some of your biggest challenges?
Well, that does involve showing, I once showed up, Greenland is the same trip that I should have been scared, but wasn't. I had to take a helicopter, and this was a huge expense, an expense that a magazine doesn't take on very often, to helicopter someone out onto the ice sheet. And it was fogged in for days, and it took a lot longer to get up there, and had the fog not lifted, I would never have gotten up there, and the story never would have gotten written. So that that kind of thing, it's pretty rare. You have to, as I say, be going somewhere pretty exotic, and showing up in Australia when nothing was going on. That was not, that was just a screw up of epic proportions.
So the Notes from a Catastrophe came out of a 3-part series you did in the New Yorker that was really seminal. It was extremely important and had a huge effect. How did that series come about then? Was that your idea? Did you propose it to the New Yorker?
Yeah, well, it was, as I mentioned before, I had this idea. I was going to finally settle this question, whether global warming was the biggest problem in the world or not. And as I talked to people, as I talked to scientists, I became pretty convinced, that it was. And I went to David Remnick, the editor of he was the at that time new editor of the New Yorker, and I said, I want to do a piece. At that point, this was in the 2002 or so, you really found the clearest evidence, which is still true, in the Arctic. I was going to do a piece about climate change in the Arctic. I said, I want to do this, it'd be a big piece, long piece, 10,000 words or whatever. And it was David, really, who said, if you are convinced this is the biggest issue facing the world, you should do a 3-part series. And honestly, that was quite terrifying, because I really didn't have 3 parts in my mind. So I had to, but it seemed like if he was willing to offer the space in the magazine, I had to rise to the moment. So I thought about it. I still didn't have the idea for the other 2 parts, but I said, you give me a year, I'll give you a 3-part series, and that was our deal.
Oh. And then that led to The Sixth Extinction, the book that you wrote, which, let's see, it was David Gran called it one of the most important and defining books of our time, and I would have to agree, and it, of course, won the Pulitzer Prize. And that, what an extraordinary book that was. So how did then you segue from, this Notes from a Catastrophe in this 3-part series? You did a whole series of articles in the New Yorker on that then led into The Sixth Extinction. You put them together and revised them and created this extraordinarily important book. Tell us about that.
Well, that book really came, and this has a local angle for everyone here. I had been looking for a long time for a way to write about what was being called the Amphibian Crisis, which was the die-off of frogs and toads around the world. And I finally came across it, which I relate in The Sixth Extinction, when my kids got National Geographic Kids. And there was a piece about a frog hotel, the hotel that they were putting these frogs in. They were taking them out of the rainforest before this disease, which is really the major cause of the die-off, could sweep through. And I finally thought, okay, here's a way to write about this issue. And just as that happened, there was news that started to emanate out of Albany about this bat die-off, which we now know was caused also by a pathogen, an imported pathogen. And these 2 stories came together, and I read in the course of doing the research on the amphibian crisis, this piece that was titled, Are We in the Midst of the Sixth Mass Extinction? The View from Amphibians. And that really was what set me down this path. It was not even a term I had heard, But I thought, wow, if that's the way scientists are talking about this event, which everyone knew as sort of, the biodiversity crisis, extinction crisis or whatever, but if we're really talking about this in terms of comparable only, to the 5 great mass extinctions in history, the most recent of which you have written about so wonderfully, that killed off the dinosaurs, wow, that's an even bigger story than climate change. Could there be a bigger story than climate change? Only one, really.
Well, and then there's a term for the new age that we've created called the Anthropocene. Could you talk about that and how that differs from the Holocene, which is what we originally were calling that period? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of, human-centric. We look at the world very much through our own eyes. So the latest epoch in history, in geological history, and is the time since the last ice age. So 12,000 years ago, if you'd been right here in Lennox, you would have been under a mile of ice. And the Holocene is the time we live in. It's really it should be just an interglacial heading into another ice age. When exactly that new ice age would begin is debated, but in maybe 20,000 years or so, let's say. But we stepped in. The Holocene is a time of human civilization. It turns out to have been an anomalously stable period, which many geologists and historians think is no coincidence. Agriculture was invented. Humans have been around for 300,000 years, but we only got to agriculture during the Holocene and when the climate really settled down. And then we, managed to be so successful that we started to burn fossil fuels, and that has, among many other things, doubtless delayed the onset of another ice age for no one knows exactly how long. Kind of depends on how far we go. But the idea behind the Anthropocene is that we are now the major geological force. We rival the great forces of geology that have defined geological history since time immemorial, and that if you come back, if you were a geologist or an alien geologist, if you come back in 100 million years or so, you will find signs that something very weird was going on right now. And there is a vast scientific literature on this that is very compelling, that you will see that something very strange happened right now. And one of the things you will see is this extinction event.
Mm-hmm. And so with the 6th extinction, you also went to the farthest corners of the earth reporting on this story. And I remember reading some of the interesting experiences you had, including almost embracing a tarantula, if I recall. Could you talk about some of those reporting experiences?
Yeah, well, writing the 6th extinction was, it was sort of paradoxical that I got to go to some of the really last great remaining, as wild as you can get places on the planet, including, in that particular case, I was in Panama, in the rainforest there, looking for amphibians, actually, and but to the Amazon, to the Great Barrier Reef. And so I had a sort of, as I say, paradoxically, a wonderful time going to these amazing places. But in each one of them, I was with scientists who were, looking for the signs of this extinction event, and and finding them. There's no mystery here, so it was a weird mixed experience where, you felt like you were way beyond human civilization when you're out on the Great Barrier Reef in the middle of the night. There's really, it seems like you are at the edge of the known world. But what we were there to do was to measure the chemistry of the water, which is, observably, measurably, daily changing, owing to all the carbon dioxide that we're pouring into the air, a lot of which ends up in the oceans pretty quickly, and is changing the chemistry of the oceans, acidifying the oceans. So everywhere we went, at the edge of, way beyond the edge of civilization, we were looking for the signs of human activity, which are so pervasive that they're everywhere. And that is really the idea behind the Anthropocene. You could go anywhere and you would find, if you were a geochemist or a biochemist, you could find signs of humanity.
Does it amaze you that there are still people out there who are climate deniers? I mean, what do you think is going on there? What is the psychology of the climate denier in the face of this overwhelming evidence?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. I was just out at Hoover Dam doing some reporting, and so Hoover Dam is on the Colorado, the Nevada-Arizona border, and behind it is Lake Mead, which is our biggest reservoir, and really millions of people depend on it. The whole city of Las Vegas depends on it. A lot of our agriculture depends on it, and it's 3/4 empty right now, okay? So you look out at Lake Mead, and there's this formation, I guess you could call it. It's another geological formation. It's called the Bathtub Ring, and it's made up of just minerals that were deposited on the walls of this canyon as the water level dropped. So you can see where the water level was, and now it's way, way down. And I talk to people, a lot of people, I just randomly would go up to people and ask them, what do you see when you look out at this reservoir, in this bathtub ring? And a lot of people said to me, some people say, I see a scary future. And some people said to me, well, I see, a cycle, a natural cycle. It's not in our hands. It's up to, God. What happens, and I didn't argue with them and say, well, really, it's up to us what happens. But I think there's a lot of that sentiment out there. This is not, this is just not something that we could control. And I think the combination of the fact that it's more comforting to believe that. I mean, they didn't deny that there was a drought. I mean, you can't deny that there was a drought, but somehow this was part of some grand cycle. The ice ages come and go, droughts come and go. This was going to come and go. And that is a very difficult sentiment. I do think, I will say now, having talked to water managers out in the West, I think that there was even that sentiment among them until fairly recently. And now I think everyone's convinced, well, I might believe, in a grand plan of creation, but I've got to plan for the fact that there's not going to be any water.
But it seems like this climate denialism is a peculiarly American phenomenon. I mean, you go to Europe, and even the right-wing parties in Europe recognize it. So what is it about Americans specifically that makes them deny this apparent reality?
Well, I mean, I should throw that question to you, Doug. I mean, what is it about Americans that make them not believe in COVID? I don't believe in the disease. What is it about us? I guess, that, no one's ever gone broke underestimating the American people. What is that? Is that P.T. Barnum or something? I don't know. I mean, the level of, I think, climate change is one where you can see if you work in the oil industry, if you work in the gas industry, there's a lot of this country that's dependent on its extractive industries. We're still a very extractive economy. And, we are now an oil exporter again, so there's a lot of jobs dependent on it. And Al Gore likes to quote this line, I think it's from Upton Sinclair, it's very hard to convince someone of something if their livelihood depends on not believing it. So you can kind of understand the economic reasons and also the, climate change is, we're all implicated in climate change, we're all participating in it every day, every moment, helping to make it worse. And I think that is very painful for people, and I can kind of even understand that it's easier just not to believe in it. Now then then a deadly disease comes along where your own life, you think this species could not have survived till now, if they can't believe in a deadly disease, and yet we saw that. So, you explain to me how that species survived. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting at the very end of Under a White Sky, which is your last book, an excellent book, by the way. and I want to ask you about that in a second. But you talk about COVID, and then it leads to a very dark conclusion about our inability to deal with COVID. Really is reflective of our inability to deal with climate change, and it's a very scary thought that you leave us with in that book without really answering it. But would it be out of line to ask you for some predictions, since you know more about this subject than just about anybody? I mean, where are we going to be? Where are our great-grandchildren going to be? What kind of world are they going to be living in, do you think?
Well, I mean, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future, as they say. But, there are a couple things that I can tell you for sure. They're going to be living in a warmer world, no doubt about that. There's just no way around that, unless we start, really messing with the stratosphere, which is where under a white sky eventually goes. But even then, they're going to be living in a warmer world. They're going to be living in a world with higher sea levels and more extreme weather. I think I can say that very confidently. Now, how we respond to that, how humanity responds to that is the big. So there's three big question marks right now. One is, how far do we go? How much carbon do we put up there? When our great-grandchildren are around, will we have globally stopped emitting carbon? Because that's what it's going to take to stabilize the climate. I can't answer that. We are really not at all sure where these sort of what are being called tipping points in the climate are. When do you guarantee that, Greenland is going to melt down? Have we already crossed some of those thresholds? Those are really unclear scientific questions. And then there's the great unknown of how humanity responds to a much more stressful world. And, not to begin the morning on like a total downer, we don't seem to be doing very well right now, and you ain't seen nothing yet, So I have a hard time painting an optimistic picture, but our great-grandchildren might not be around for quite a while, and a lot will have happened, and including potentially sort of reaching maximum human population on the planet, which unfortunately keeps sort of being put off. But by the end of this century, presumably the human population, just because of these demographic trends, will start to trend down, and that will make things easier to deal with. One of the many, many difficulties that we have right now is that we have a growing population that has to eat, and that's really hard. Just feeding 10 billion people is going to be really hard.
Well, your last book, Under a White Sky, deals with, three ways we might attack this problem. One is, stopping putting carbon in the atmosphere, taking carbon out, and geoengineering. So talk a little bit about the title of the book, where that came from, because that's an interesting point, and leading us into what might be done, what we might do to but to mitigate the problem.
Well, so that book is really looking at the ways that we tend to reach for, new interventions to solve the previous interventions, which we don't like the consequences of. And so in the case of climate change, we don't like the consequences of having dumped a lot of CO2 into the air, even though, we've been warned about this. The first report went to President Lyndon Johnson, and I urge you to look it up. It's online. It's unbelievably prescient, in 1965. So this is not, people often date warnings about climate change to the late 80s, say early 90s, but in fact, they go back to 1965. This has been a pretty well understood problem for quite a long time by people who were paying attention, and admittedly, it was a very small group at that time. At that report in 1965, they say, well, we're burning a lot of fossil fuels, we're probably not going to stop doing that because they're very useful and convenient and they run our economy. And so we're going to have to look for ways to counteract this. And in that report, they suggest, well, we're going to throw a lot of reflective stuff. I don't know, ping pong balls, I don't really know, stuff in the oceans. We're going to just make the oceans reflective, because the oceans are very dark, they absorb a lot of heat, and they're going to reflect a lot of light, and that's how we're going to deal with it. And so ever since then, we have been looking on some level, we've done everything except reduce our carbon emissions. Our carbon emissions have gone up, astronomically since 1965. So, stopping our carbon emissions, which is obviously essential and which is, I do want to say for the first time sort of actually on the political agenda in the U.S. So that is some good news. The Inflation Reduction Act actually does have a lot of very positive aspects in it, and I think we will start this great energy transition finally, in 2022. Okay, so that is very positive news. But, we're deep into this, really deep into this. So in order to keep things at sort of a manageable level, a lot of these scenarios for the future involve a lot of removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. How do you get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? I'm not going to give you like the whole spiel, but it's really hard. Take my word for it. It takes energy, but there are people who say, well, we didn't have iPhones, 20 years ago. Now we have, billions of them. We can do this. We can do this, and we will do this, and we have to do it. Therefore, we will do it. So that's one possibility that I leave you with, and I'm agnostic on that. I don't know the answer to that. And then there's another group saying, well, even if you do that, even if you stop carbon emissions, we're still in the danger zone, and you're going to need to, for some time, period of time left unspecified, mess around with the stratosphere, put some reflective particles in the stratosphere, which is what volcanoes do, and counteract some of the global warming with global cooling. And that is solar geoengineering. It's a very controversial idea, but I will make one prediction, one firm prediction this morning. It's not going away because we don't have a lot of tools, a lot of arrows in the quiver for dealing with climate change. You can't stop it. It's not a stoppable process unless you try to counteract it in some way. So I think this conversation, very emotional among scientists who hate each other over this issue passionately, that conversation is going to continue, and probably research is going to start happening in the stratosphere in a very limited way, and eventually maybe in a larger way, and eventually maybe we will do it. And I also can't see the future. I can't tell you whether that's going to happen or not.
And the putting of particles in the atmosphere might turn it white. That is where the title of the book comes from.
Yes, I mean, it would. I think it would have this reflective quality, and I've actually seen mock-ups of what it would look like. It would not be white, it would be whiter. But, in defense of this, I would say when you go to Manhattan, the sky is very rarely deep blue because there's a lot of particles, between you and the sun. So, we live with this all the time. You see pictures of New Delhi. I have never been to New Delhi, but, where you can't see the sun at all. So we live with a lot of, unnaturalness in our lives. This would be another level. It would be, some people would argue, the ultimate unnaturalness. But what we're doing right now, warming the world is pretty unnatural. You could argue it's a form of geoengineering. It's just that we're doing it without thinking.
Mm. Well, you quote a climate scientist, Dan Schrag, who said that right now we have put enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that eventually, because there's a flywheel effect, it takes a little bit of time, eventually we're going to see a 4 degrees centigrade or 7.2 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature, which is really unthinkable. I mean, that the world, I remember reading, maybe it was in one of your articles, about that whole sections of the Earth might become completely unlivable to human beings, at a 4-degree centigrade rise in temperature. I mean, do you feel that that's accurate? Do you feel that that's likely? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll say two things. I think Dan is out there on I don't think we're committed to 4 degrees at this point. I think most scientists would say we're not committed to 4 degrees, though there are, really dangerous feedback loops potentially in the climate that can run out of control, and I won't get into them, but like methane feedbacks releasing a lot of carbon that's in the soil, for example. So I think we are probably, we have it, I won't say definitely, almost certainly we do have it in our power to avoid 4 degrees. But 4 degrees is certainly not out of the question if we, just keep on our merry way here. And 4 degrees is a radically different planet. Large swaths of the world, yes, would be not habitable for humans. And I think, this past summer was, a wake-up call. I mean, in a lot of the world, temperature record after temperature record. It was not a particularly brutal summer here in the Northeast, here in the Berkshires, but in Europe, it was unprecedented. In England, it was unprecedented. China had unprecedented heat for a lot of the summer, and you're going to see that reflected in commodity prices now. A lot of crops withering. So it was a bad summer, and it was, as I say, just the beginning. I mean, there's more climate change to come, even were we to stop basically tomorrow, which clearly we're not doing.
Well, very good. Well, I think our time has come to maybe call for some questions from the audience, which I'm sure there are going to be quite a few. Yes.
You were talking about Lake Mead and the bathtub rings. I remember back in the 70s during the oil embargoes, they said, oil is short, but in the future, water will be even more of a critical resource. Here we are, even in the Berkshires. So if you were given authority over, say, all the western states, what rules, regulations, infrastructure would you start enacting?
Sure.
Yes, the question was, given the water crisis in the western states, what sort of policies would you advocate to deal with that now?
So the good news about water, well, I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is we're operating according to the Colorado River Compact, which was signed actually exactly a century ago in November, I think. And that, completely over-allocated the Colorado River. It was based on, crazy assumptions about how much the Colorado would deliver. And that's what we're still operating on, even though clearly the Colorado is never delivered that much water and is delivering less and less water. So that's the bad news. And no one wants to give up their allocation. Right? Okay, so that goes without saying almost. The good news is that a lot of the water from the Colorado is used to grow alfalfa in the desert, which is a crazy thing to do. And if you stop doing that, for cattle feed. And so, if you ate a lot fewer hamburgers, I don't mean you, if the world ate a lot fewer burgers and we didn't grow that alfalfa, it's not like we don't have enough water carefully managed for people to drink. We don't have enough water for this system of agriculture that we've developed using basically cheap water. So how we get from A to B, if I were king of the world, obviously I would just, mandate that, right? But I'm not, and how we are going to get from A to B is very difficult, really, really hard to see. And I think a lot of, people are working on it. They're in negotiations. There's going to be there was one round of cuts that will start in January. There's another round that will probably start the next January. There'll be huge litigation. It will be a huge mess.
Yes.
This question also about water, because a professor said recently that cars were into the 19th century and technology was 20th century, water is going to be 21st. desalination projects, which are being built all over the world but in the United States, seem to be anticipating the idea that we do need drinkable, potable water. They're very expensive, and they're billions of dollars to build. But if we were able to even convince Congress to do something like that, how many would we need to actually get us to place of safety?
The question, I'll just repeat it so everyone can hear it. It's about desalination projects is as a way of providing water. They're very expensive, but what are your thoughts on how many should we do this and how many should we do, and is this a possibility?
Well, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm no expert at all on this. I think one of the issues, though, is we're a big country, sort of where a lot of the real water needs, are in places like Nevada, which are pretty far from the coast, right? So, how much desalination can really alleviate, and desalination for agriculture is, insane, crazy, completely insane. So, how much desalination can play a role in this crisis, and how much we just have to, 150 years ago, John Wesley Powell, who was one of the first people to go down the Colorado, said, you cannot settle the West the way you settled the East. There's just not enough water. Now, no one paid any attention to him, and here we are. But that theme, and I really recommend a book. If you're looking for a really good book to read, have you read Cadillac Desert? It's all about, the ways in which we insisted that the West could be farmed. It cannot be farmed. So we're going to have to readjust the way we think about things and the way we live and where people live, probably. But I'm not sure that desalination can really solve some of these big structural problems.
Right. Yes.
Thank you. In terms of water for agriculture in the Midwest, my understanding is that the big aquifers underneath are being pumped out at a furious rate and not being replenished. What effect would that have 20, 30 years from now, in addition to the temperature rise?
Okay, so that question was about the aquifers in the Midwest getting pumped out, and what effect is that going to have? And once again, I don't want to punt, but the Ogallala Reservoir, is definitely getting pumped out. That's very clear. People have to go farther and farther, and that is another huge issue. We are using, even in places where they use the Colorado, they're also using groundwater, and they're using it up. It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue in India, where the groundwater table is falling at an astonishing rate, and sometimes taking the ground down with it. So it's a huge issue in a lot of places, a lot of agricultural areas, and that water takes thousands of years, in some cases to recharge. So we are. It's all part of a theme. We are running through unreplenishable resources at a very, very rapid rate, and then that raises the question of, okay, what are we going to do? And then there are the political answers. We're going to reorganize things. We're going to have to reorganize things. And there are the technological answers. We are so clever, we're going to think of some way around this, desalination, whatever it is. And you can choose which do you think is more, more plausible or more implausible. But presumably we will, on some level, muddle through or not. People talk about a conflict over water. I think that's quite possible in coming decades.
Sherry?
Thank you, Doug. As someone who grew up in Arizona, where in August it was 110 degrees and now it's 120, would you recommend Arizonans start buying property in Alaska?
Did everyone hear that? The question was about my real estate recommendations. I shy away. How's that, from making real estate recommendations? But I mean, one of the interesting things, and it's genuinely interesting, how's that? A great thing about being a journalist is these questions, you can call them interesting, is, people are flocking to parts of the country, Miami, which is going to be underwater, Phoenix, which is going to be really obscenely hot, already is, Las Vegas, which has, very little water, no water. They have a very small allocation from the Colorado, and they have to live within it. So, if you had a society where, we had some kind of planning, you would say, okay, well, you have to restrict development in parts of the country where there's no water or where there's too much water. But we don't do that. We're going to just allow everyone to move to these places and then go, So I don't know. I really don't know, obviously, what's going to happen. Would I personally, buy Arizona real estate right now? I'm a very conservative investor. How's that?
Yes.
Can you say something about climate refugees? Because that's a big problem.
Well, so the question is about climate refugees, and that, are people from Arizona, I just read 2 books. There are 2, one has come out and one is coming out, and one was about climate migration internationally, and one is about climate migration internally, and both are going to be big issues, and I think that potentially extremely destabilizing, I mean, we're about to have an election in Italy on tomorrow, where, a post-fascist party is going to come to power largely on an anti-immigrant sentiment, and what happened, I don't think most of the refugees that have been pouring into Europe are at this point directly climate related, but you're getting a taste of what movement of many, many millions of people is going to look like, and to think of a kind of optimistic way through that where we all just accept that the world has to be reorganized and that certain places are going to be uninhabitable and certain other places are going to have to accommodate refugees. It's hard to imagine the politics of that right now. And even internally in the US, it's not necessarily easy to imagine the politics of that. So these are huge, we are leaving the realm of geophysics and entering the world of humans, and that is in my mind, one of the biggest question marks. How are we going to respond to these stresses?
Mm-hmm. Right.
First of all, I just want to say that it's very hard to think of climate change without Colbert scene right behind you mentioned about particles in the atmosphere to stop them reflect back the light from the sun. How would this affect photosynthesis?
So the question is about, if you were to pursue geoengineering and put reflective particles in the stratosphere, how would that affect photosynthesis and, I guess, agriculture, or the lovely trees in the Berkshires? The good news is that plants actually like diffuse light. I don't think that agriculture or photosynthesis we're talking about a very small fraction of the sunlight that hits the earth, and I don't think that that's the biggest concern. How's that? I think that plants would, until you really bit into sunlight, plants would do fine. Once you started really biting into sunlight, it would be game over anyway, so don't worry about that. But it would affect photovoltaics, which are more sensitive, so people worry about that. So it would affect solar power production to a certain extent.
In your book, you talk about this debate about putting particles in the atmosphere, that it's gotten so crazy that scientists are receiving death threats. Why is that aroused such tremendous passion?
Well, I think people see it as sort of the kind of the work of the devil, I guess. There's also a huge contrails world of people who already think that the government is, messing around with the atmosphere. So that's one part of the, that's kind of the crazy part, and I think that is a part of the people who really, follow this debate and see this as evidence of like, okay, yeah, the government is already screwing with your atmosphere and, poisoning us, et cetera. Okay. And then there are people who just see it, there's a huge, anti-GMO movement in this country and around the world, even though GMOs are everywhere, we're eating them constantly. But people feel very, very passionately about, some idea, and I don't want to say, I don't mean to be dismissive, but some idea of the way the world is, and let's not mess with that, even though, it doesn't necessarily comport with actually how the world really is. But yes, these scientists at Harvard, who works on this issue and is very closely identified with this issue, told me he had received, credible death threats.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I have just two quick questions. Do you take antidepressants? What do you say to people who are about to have children or thinking of having children?
So the first question was whether I take antidepressants. And the second question is, what do I say to people who are thinking about having kids? And as to the first, no, but I would like to. I should have started years ago. And the second is, a really profoundly, difficult and personal one. I have kids who are, approaching, reproductive age. How's that? They would not like to hear me say that. And my oldest who actually studies climate science, I guess this gives you, has told me in no uncertain terms he does not want to have children. So I think it's a very, I also, look, there's always been terrible stuff in the world. My mother was born, in Nazi Germany. And so, is this a uniquely bad time? I think it's a, potentially uniquely dangerous time, but, humanity has history is pretty dark. Let's face it, and people have always had children. That's sort of what we're evolutionarily programmed to do. But if someone said to me, I've decided, we don't need to bring any more humans into the world, I respect and to a certain extent admire that choice. But I would never say to someone, don't have children.
All right, way in the back.
So you talked about the shortage of water, but much of Pakistan is drowning today, and part of the change that has occurred is we don't get glaciers anymore because it's hotter.
I'm sorry, we don't get what?
Glaciers.
Yeah.
Anymore because it's hotter.
Mm-hmm.
And the result is that water flow is enormous at some times and not at all present at others. How is that change to be managed?
I'm sorry, the last part is how is that change?
How is that change to be managed?
Yeah.
From snow, which is
right.
gradual and released to...
Yeah. So did everyone hear that question is about managing this new water regime where we don't get snowpack in the winter, which is that's the big problem on the Colorado, that there's not snow. Not that there's not glaciers, but that there's not snow. There's not the snowpack. That's what the Colorado depends on. But also that we get tremendous flooding in Pakistan, which was also a result of just massively heavy rainfall, which we're seeing more and more. And we're seeing massively heavy rainfall as very much a part of climate cycle. We've changed the hydrological cycle. Warmer air can hold more moisture, so it just holds more moisture, and we get drought. It evaporates more water, and then somewhere else that water falls out. And sometimes it's going to be, right here in the Berkshires. You can see in the Berkshires. I've lived here 30 years. That, and this is, a fact. We can just look at the facts. More of our rain falls in these massive downpours. Right? Sometimes you feel like this is a tropical downpour, which really, you used to get, obviously big thunderstorms in the summer, but we get much more of our rainfall falling in these big dumps. And so that system, that cycle of drought, which we had really quite a bad drought this summer, and then flooding, that is very hard to manage, as your question implied. And we're going to have to, come up with more ways to store water when we have it. Then you have the problem of it evaporating off. So I say it's a very good time to get it. If you have kids, into water management. I think that's going to be a huge, huge issue.
Hey, we have to wrap up just a minute or two early because apparently there's a big group of people trying to get in for the 11:30. If you are one of the people who have an 11:30 ticket, you can keep your jacket on your chair. And but if you don't and you want to be at the 11:30 session, please go out, wait for us to let the people with the tickets in, and then find an empty seat, which we are pretty sure there will be. Let's thank Doug and Betsy.
Thank you, Doug,
for this amazing talk.
Thank you.
And a reminder for Betsy, Doug and Betsy's books are out on the book table. They are both already signed copies, but if you want a personal message, Doug and Betsy will be there to inscribe one as well. So if you just want their autograph, that's all set at the table. But if you want a personal message, you can go there. Another thing, Wild Symphony pop-up, if you're going, it is not here. It is not here. It is at Lenox High School on East Street. And I think that's it, but I do want to leave you with this poem by Maggie Smith. It is called Good Bones. And this is basically an answer to your question in the front row. Life is short, though I keep that from my children. Life is short, and I've shortened mine in 1,000 delicious, ill-advised ways. 1,000 deliciously ill-advised ways I will keep from my children. The world is at least 50% terrible, and that's a conservative estimate, though I keep this from my children. For every bird, there is a stone thrown at a bird. For every loved child, a child broken, bagged, sunk in a lake. Life is short, and the world is at least half terrible, and for every kind stranger, there is one who would break you, though I keep this from my children. I'm trying to sell them the world. Any decent realtor walking you through a real shithole chirps on about good bones. This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful.